Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome along to the Joto Sawgrass webinar. My name is David Elvin, and I look after sales for Joto in Western North America. Today, we're going to be talking about the different options there are when it comes to imaging different types of fabrics and what processes work best for those different substrates. In a moment, I'll be handing you over to Jimmy Lamb. Jimmy is Sawgrass's Manager of Education and Communications, and he's going to be your presentation host for today's webinar. At the end of Jimmy's presentation, there will be a chance to have any questions you have answered. So if anything comes up during the presentation, please write those questions down and we can go over those at the end. So over to you, Jimmy.
Thanks, David. Great to be here, as always. And this is a great subject here. I mean, I love talking about the different ways that we can decorate apparel. A lot of times people are getting into sublimation and it doesn't quite sink in initially. Sublimation only works with polyester. It doesn't work with cotton. Actually, I like to joke. You can sublimate cotton, just don't wash it, okay? Because then it's not there anymore. It's invisible ink. But the reality is, as David was saying, we do have to pay attention to the fabrics because we do have different types of processes and applications and products for different types of fabrics. And that's what we're really looking at is sublimation versus digital inkjet printing. And by the way, we're also going to talk a little bit about laser printing too. So in the title, I'll put inkjet, but the reality, David's going to tell you some about the laser papers as well as the inkjet papers that are available from Joto. All right, so let's go ahead and get started here and start taking a look at what we got going. If you haven't noticed it, there is a big demand and has been for a while for full color t-shirt printing. So the reality is if you can produce the products and deliver them, you can make some money on it, okay? But when you start looking at what's the right system to use and what is the right product to sell, that's where it gets a little bit tricky. Now, traditionally, screen printing has been the method of choice, really the king, as I like to say, of printing onto t-shirts. But you will also find, if you start digging into screen printing, that with screen printing, it's the same ink doesn't necessarily work for every type of fabric. So there are some different inks and considerations you have to think about there. DTG, when DTG actually came out, everyone said it would replace screen printing, and it did not. Okay, it's its own little corner of the marketplace, but it may not be the right thing for you. And both of these processes are rather expensive to get into, and both have limitations. So you have to consider that as they may be popular for t-shirts, but is it right for you? Okay. If you look a little deeper, for example, at screen printing, with screen printing, you have this very long, drawn-out setup. Okay, you have to specialize your artwork out so that you're dividing it by colors. Okay, we call it color separations. When you do the color separations, you make an individual screen for each color in the design. So you have to then think about that. How many screens can I put on my system? And how many colors are in the design? So your actual equipment can limit the range of color that you can print because of the fact you have to split every image up by color. Okay, time consuming. And by the time you go through the process, I'm not going to explain it to you, of burning screens and mounting them and putting them on and lining everything up, you spend several hours to set up for any basic multicolor design. You'll find, though, with screen printing that once you're up and running, it's fairly inexpensive to print, but the real big cost is that setup. Okay, because if you're taking 3 or 4 hours, you do have to charge for that. And nobody wants to spend that much time to do 4 t-shirts. So the reality is screen printing is better suited for larger runs. And that's where it becomes a little bit more cost effective. But definitely there's a cost to get in because there's a lot of equipment you have to use. Direct to garment printing, the same thing. Direct to garment printing, you don't have to do color separations. Okay. And the reality is if you have a really good image, you can send it through a RIP or some type of color management system over to the DTG system, and then it starts printing. Okay, now DTG is a little bit pricey, I will say, but it is simpler than screen printing so that you can do small runs. But you also have to pay attention to the ink. The ink that's used in DTG printers is traditionally created specifically for cotton and cotton blends. And you will not find that DTG ink typically works at all with polymers and polyesters. And that is a big part of the marketplace right now because of products like Under Armour, which have made it very mainstream. There is a big demand for poly performance products. And there's even poly performance products that look and feel like cotton. So cotton isn't as much a king as it used to be. And if you've never really tried some of these poly performance products, because a lot of times you hear polyester, you just think hot, hot and sticky, right? You'd be surprised. Poly performance, and when we say poly performance, it means it has moisture wicking cells. The poly performance products, if you go outside and it's 100 degrees, I see that here where I live in North Carolina. If you go out when it's 100 degrees and 90% humidity, that's a fun day. With a 100% cotton t-shirt, you'll come back in drenched, okay? Now, if you go out with your poly performance shirt, you'll probably still come back in drenched, but I'll guarantee you feel cooler in the poly performance than you will in the 100% cotton. So we really have to think about that, because we have to think about, people talk about t-shirts. A lot of times they're just thinking about 100% cotton t-shirts, but there's so much more out there. So again, what is the right process and what fits your budget? Because both DTG and screen printing are going to take some time and money to get into. Well, the neat thing is digital transfers. Digital transfers have really, really developed over the last 10 or 15 years. And the whole concept of a digital transfer is that we use an inkjet printer to print paper, print onto paper that absorbs the ink, holds it on the paper. We go over and put that onto the t-shirt, put it under a heat press, and the combination of pressure and temperature causes the paper to release that ink onto the surface or into the surface, depending on what system we're using, of that t-shirt. Okay, so essentially the paper is only being used to move the ink from the printer over to the t-shirt, and then that paper gets discarded. Now, when we say the word transfer, transfer is it's tough. I mean, when you look up transfer, there's all kinds of transfers out there. So it is important to really specify what we're talking about here. And what I'm talking about is digital transfer printing, most of which we'll talk about is inkjet, but David will also talk about laser digital transfer printing as well. Okay, so I just want to be clear on that, because if you look at other transfers, some transfers are like vinyl products. In a vinyl product, you're actually cutting out material and it has adhesive on the back, and we're using heat to activate that adhesive so the material itself bonds to the shirt. Okay, that's not a digital transfer, but that's what is more of a film or material-based type transfer. So like I said, there's lots of different things out there that qualify as transfers, but we're really kind of narrowing down for our discussion here. Now, the two types that we're really going to focus on are dye sublimation printing. Okay, and dye sublimation printing, it only works with polymers and polyester. It's very important. Okay, but it bonds at a molecular level, so it's a very unique bonding process. It's different from anything else. The result is that the image doesn't peel, crack, or fade when it's being laundered. Okay, inkjet transfer printing looks a whole lot like sublimation printing when you compare them, head to head. I mean, they really look like you're doing the same thing. The difference is in the chemistry, though, because now we're talking about inks that are designed really for cotton and cotton blends. Okay, that's typically what you're going to get with most of your inkjet transfer papers. Okay, and the paper itself is designed to work with specific inks, and these papers may look the same on the surface, but it's a lot of times what you don't see on the surface that makes all the difference in how they work. Okay, so typically when we're using inkjet transfer printing, we're putting the ink onto the surface of the shirt, and if you rub that area, you can lightly feel it. We call that hand, how it feels when you touch it with your hand. Okay, sublimation actually goes down inside the fiber, so you cannot feel it. So, but again, they look almost identical. Okay, when you compare it, you use a computer, you set up your images, you use an inkjet printer equipped with the proper ink, of course. And then you have transfer paper and you have heat press. A lot of the settings are almost the same too, with temperature, time, and pressure, very close. But as I was saying, the difference is in the chemistry, the inks, and the transfer paper. Now, ink to surface chemistry. Very important to understand. If you go into a paint store, they have paint for metal and wood and concrete and everything you can imagine, right? Why don't they just have one paint? Because one paint is not formulated to work with everything. That's why. Okay, so each specific type of paint is formulated for a specific surface. That is because you have to make sure it bonds to the surface and also carries the color over the right way. Same thing goes with t-shirt printing, or really any kind of printing, because we print more than just t-shirts, right? You have to make sure that the ink will be compatible with the surface, or else what's going to happen is the first time somebody washes it, half the design is going to just disappear, or it's going to crack and peel within a couple of washings, and that's not acceptable. So that's why it's important to understand that we have different products that give us different results, and you really have to learn your products. Now, the neat thing about Joto is that they carry lots of these products, and David's going to tell you more about them. And the reality is, with their staff there, they can help you find the right product for what you need to do. Okay, so it's really important. You don't just say, hey, I need to get a transfer. You need to talk to them about what you want to do with the transfer so that, again, they can help you get the right product to make the job work the right way. Now, transfer papers are really neat. I've written a whole article. Actually, I've done a whole webinar more than once just on transfer papers, okay, talking about how they're engineered and everything that goes on with them. I mean, there's a lot that goes on with paper. I mean, you pick it up and it looks like a piece of paper you print on, just regular, like an invoice or something, right? But again, it's all that stuff you don't see. That's so important. One of the things that you find with most digital transfer papers is something called a binding agent. And the binding agent is basically, in simple terms, is basically an adhesive that's contained within the paper, so that when you print the ink to the paper, the ink is absorbed by the paper. Then when you take it to the heat press to put it on the t-shirt, the combination of heat and pressure not only releases the ink, it also releases the binding agent to help the ink permanently bond to the surface of whatever it is that we're printing. Okay, so binders are a very important aspect for most applications, with the exception of sublimation. Sublimation doesn't require a binding agent, so there's none in the paper. So don't ever confuse your papers, okay, because they may look alike. Your standard digital transfer paper is not going to work properly for sublimation, and sublimation is not going to work for the other processes. So again, understand your papers. All right, so let's start and talk about inkjet transfers first, okay? And really, most of what I'm going to say with inkjet transfers does apply to laser. So any of you that do have laser, you're looking to do laser printing, the concepts are the same, even though the chemistry is different, okay? All right, so what do you need to do it? Well, you need software, okay? That makes sense. The neat thing is you don't really have to have a special software. You just, anything you can do graphics with. But please focus on graphics software. I've had people ask me if, like, Microsoft Word was a graphics program, and I said no, and their response was, well, I can create a graphic on there and print it. Okay, the answer is still no. Okay, but let's assume you do have a real graphic software. You need an inkjet printer, and for so many of these inkjet transfers, when we talk about an inkjet printer, a lot of times it's really just your basic office printer using office ink. The paper that you're going to use, the transfer paper you're going to use, if it's designed for that, then it will work with that ink. And then really and truly, office style inks weren't designed for t-shirts. Okay, they weren't designed to bond to t-shirts. They're designed to bond to papers. Okay, regular just printing paper. But when you're using transfer paper made for, doing 100% cotton t-shirt, for example, then the chemistry of the paper, the binder of the paper, is such that if it's used with standard ink, we call it OEM ink, okay, then it's got a binding agent that will bond that ink to that t-shirt, because it really maybe wasn't designed for that initially. So you have the right transfer press and you have the heat press. You have those four things. You can make this happen, okay? So the way it works, if we look at your standard transfer paper, is we're going to print to it, and the paper will receive the ink during printing. So it typically has little microcells in there that allow the ink to be absorbed, but it's also set up so that it will be released when heat is applied. Not all papers are designed to do that, okay? Transfer paper is. So it's going to absorb it, it's going to release the ink during pressing, and it's also going to release the binders during pressing as well. So that's what's going to happen. If you actually look at the insides of a paper, just to show you how complex they can be, you have your ink management layer, which is where you absorb the ink. You have your binder layer, which is going to be released when heat's applied along with the ink. You have a release layer that's designed to make sure everything does release properly, okay? And then you have a paper base, okay, a real paper base, and then you have a coating so that it doesn't curl up, when it gets wet with ink. Believe it or not, we got all those layers in paper, and yet you pick up a paper and it's just thin as it can be, and you're like, how can that be? Don't question it, just believe it. I wear contacts. I wonder the same thing sometimes. Now, one of the things that you will find sometimes with inkjet transfers that you need to be aware of, okay? Some binders will transfer with the the binder transfers with the graphic, but it may transfer where there's no ink. So this is a bit of an exaggeration in the image, but you could see with some papers a visible residue on the garment where the blank parts of the paper were. We call that a polymer window. Okay. Now with some of these, it's as simple as just pulling it off the heat press and stretching it, and it'll actually kind of break loose that part where the ink is not. I've also, when I've encountered it, I've usually found if I just change some of my settings on the heat press, I can get it where I still get a beautiful transfer, but I don't get the polymer window. Some people will trim away the excess paper. Some papers will give you this more than other papers. It's just something, if you see it, you want to understand where it came from, and then you can sit down and kind of troubleshoot it out and make sure that it's not a problem. Now, David, I think you had some things you wanted to add here.
There are a couple of things. I mean, the last few slides that we've gone through, everything that Jimmy was talking about with regards to inkjet paper is applicable with laser paper too. The only thing is the chemistry on the paper when we manufacture it is different, because you're obviously imaging the paper with toner rather than with a liquid ink. But you know, the windows and all of the other applications is exactly the same as when you're using an inkjet printer. Now, I wanted to bring that up just because I know a lot of you out there have probably got laser printers as well as inkjet printers. And one of the advantages of a laser printer is if you're doing a lot of t-shirts and you want to use this technology, it is substantially less expensive to be running a laser printer than an inkjet. So, you know, if you're doing a handful of shirts, inkjet is a very good way to do this because the papers run very easily. They don't have a tendency to jam in any inkjet printer. But it is a little bit more a little bit more expensive to produce the shirt than it would be with a laser process. The laser processes also will work on a wider range of substrates, whereas the inkjet is dedicated only to fabric. Now, what I would say is if you're going to be doing a lot of hard surfaces, then probably sublimation is still going to be your best bet. But there are certain things like leather and wood. Joto carries a leather wood paper, and that works particularly well. So I just wanted to sort of interrupt in there just to make everybody aware that we do have those laser paper options as well. And back over to you again, Jimmy.
Okay, perfect, David. And like I've been saying all along, and I think David made it clear, a lot of different types of papers for different applications, and that's the key thing, getting the right paper for the job. So and don't let it overwhelm you. I know sometimes if you go and you go on somebody's website, you're looking at all these papers and you're like, what the heck, you know? So the reality is, you know, ask questions, experiment a little bit, because there's some really good products out there. Joto's got some excellent products. Okay, so there we are with our basics of inkjet and laser printing, but how does it compare against sublimation? Okay, now what makes sublimation different, again, is the chemistry. Because of sublimation, and I will say that sublimation is primarily an inkjet process, but with sublimation, instead of us having to put a binder to make the ink itself bond properly with the surface, sublimation bonds at a molecular level with polymers and polyesters. So you can almost think of it as like a magnet to steel kind of thing, right? I mean, it's going to go straight to a polymer or polyester and bypass cotton. I mean, it's not going to bond to cotton. Now, and that's it. I mean, it's not going to bond to cotton. I mean, I just make that clear over and over again, because I've even seen things on the internet about people talking about, you know, sublimating to cotton. Now, there are some people who have introduced some processes that will let you, within reason, apply sublimation to cotton by using a special paper or powder. But don't get confused with that. Sublimation still doesn't bond to cotton. Someone's using some type of polymer go-between to try and make this work with cotton. And, you know, if you want to delve into that, I mean, there's certainly a couple of companies doing some things, but, you know, read about it, okay, and understand it, because it's still not sublimating to cotton. And the processes used do have limitations, okay? They're not just going to work for everything. Okay, so when we do sublimation, the cool thing is sublimation bonds at a molecular level, which means it actually goes inside the fibers instead of on top of the fibers. So what we do with sublimation is we're going to print onto sublimation transfer paper. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? And then we're going to take that over to the heat press and put it onto the shirt or any of these other hard products. Remember, David said lots of other hard products. That's the cool thing about sublimation. We're going to heat it up to around 400 degrees Fahrenheit. With apparel, I usually do apparel at about 385, to be honest, but 400 is sort of like the magic sublimation number. But when we get into those ranges, two unique things happen. Number one, the sublimation dye in the paper turns into a gas. Number two, with polymer and polyester products, you're talking about microcells and microfibers that can actually open up. And I always say describe it as like a clamshell, okay? It opens up like a clamshell and allows the gas state of the ink to penetrate inside. And then when we remove the heat, that closes back up and encapsulates the ink inside the fiber instead of on the outside. So the end result is, you can't touch it. And the end result, I mean, you can't feel it because it's down in the surface. If you go to wash it, it does not crack, peel, or fade, ever, okay? That's when you're talking about sublimation on 100% polyester, okay, done properly. And again, the paper, temporary, paper gets ripped off, thrown away. All right, now the question comes up, well, can you sublimate blends? Yes, you can sublimate blends. It's only going to bond with the polymer aspect of the blend. So if you had a poly cotton shirt, it would not bond with the cotton. It will only bond with the polyester. And what you get is a washed out looking image, which I love because I use that as a special effect. I have plenty of people I've done shirts for that like the washed out retro kind of look, vintage, see keywords there. In fact, I'm going to tell you, okay, I share this with people all the time. When you're selling, too many people are looking to make it sell it for the cheapest price it can. I look to sell it for the highest price I can, okay? That doesn't always mean I can do it, right? But that's what I'm trying to do. And I know that how you describe products, how you position your products, the words that you use have an effect on the consumer, because the key is it's only worth what someone is willing to pay for it. And perception is everything. So if you can raise the perception of value of the product, you can sell it for more. Okay, so where am I going with this? I love to be able to say, and I do a lot of work with surf shops, and they like the vintage look. And I've been able to say more than once, listen, I got a great special effect we should try. We can do some really cool looking vintage stuff, okay? And I think it'd be perfect for your artwork. However, it's going to cost a little bit more because it's a specialized process. Does it cost any more? No, all I'm doing is sublimating 50-50 instead of 100% polyester. That's the only change I made. Everything else is exactly the same. The labor is the same, the ink's the same, the materials are the same, the time is the same. And in fact, a 50-50 costs less than a 100% polyester shirt. So the reality is it costs less to do, but because of the perception of it being a specialized process, I am able to charge a little bit more. Okay, I mean, that's key. So keep that in mind. If you're looking for that vintage retro kind of look, then sublimation on a 50-50 poly cotton is a great way to do it. Now, a couple of things to be aware of. Number one, the general rule is when you're doing any kind of blend is at least 50% of the blend is polyester, okay, at least 50%. The remaining 50% needs to be materials that can withstand 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, cotton can. But be careful because there's tri blends and quad blends out there now, and some of those have nylon, and nylon may melt. So you do have to be careful. You may need to experiment if you're doing a blend other than poly cotton. Nothing wrong with trying that. All right, here's the other cool thing that happens. That it does actually, the sublimation does bond, well, no, excuse me. The sublimation does temporarily adhere to the cotton in a blended shirt. But the first time you wash it, it will wash away. So you may find slight fading on a 50-50 with sublimation. Typically about 5%, not a lot, the first time you wash it. After that, it won't do anymore. But here's what I always do, and I recommend you do this too if you're going to do any kind of blended product, because you know there's going to be some fading when washed if it's blended and sublimation, is do 3 shirts. The first shirt, as soon as it comes off the heat press, set it aside. Don't do anything with it, but set it aside. Second shirt, same identical design. It comes off the heat press, wash it one time. Third shirt comes out of the heat press, wash it 5 times and label them. Okay, this one wash, this is 5 washings. And then I'll lay those 2 shirts out with that very first one, which was no washings, so you can gauge how much fading could have occurred. And you'll typically see a small amount of fading between the one that wasn't washed and the one that was washed 1 time. Typically, between the one that was washed 1 time and the one that was washed 5 times, you will see absolutely no fading, because it's usually only 1 time that gets off that excess sublimation. So I just want to be clear on that. But yeah, we can do blends. All right. So let's move on. Now, when we start talking about sublimation, and I know that our focus here was really on t-shirt and apparel decoration, but sublimation is just so cool because there are all these different hard products. Okay, so if you're just in a position to say, okay, do I want to buy a laser system or do I want to buy a sublimation system? And I'm not here to tell you which one to buy, but I'm just saying if your budget only allows you to go one way or the other, then you would start saying, okay, what's going to get me the most return on my investment? Which one's going to allow me to do the widest range of products and applications? I mean, at least that's the way I would look at it. And if you think that you only want to do t-shirts, think beyond that, because most people that buy t-shirts buy other stuff too. So if you have the ability to do other stuff too, then that can probably help you. So it's just one of the things to keep in mind. With the non-apparel products in the world of sublimation, those products either are a polymer product to begin with, or they have a polymer coating applied to them. So like all the pictures you see here, you'll see, for example, a metal flask. It has a polymer coating. You'll see an acrylic award, the Harley Davidson award. It has an acrylic, a polymer coating on the back of the acrylic. If you look in between them at the one that's Christina, that's a hard polyfiber board material, and it's got, again, a coating. If we look at the flip-flops, those are polymer based to begin with, so they may not even have a coating because they're already a polymer product. So the reality is you're going to have well over 1,000 different blank products available that are non-apparel for sublimation, as well as a pretty good range of apparel products too, because the apparel marketplace for sublimation is rapidly expanding. Okay, sublimation also, in comparison to your digital transfers done typically with laser and inkjet, dye sublimation is considered to be high def. Now, none of those right there are shirts, and in reality, when you put something on apparel, it may not look quite as high def as if it was on a non-apparel product, but you can still get some very, very good imaging on even apparel with sublimation, especially on the 100% polyester aspect. Okay, the blends, you won't get as much of definition and detail out of it. But when you do go strictly into the apparel aspect, the key thing here is we are seeing more and more products. I mean, at one time, the only thing we saw was white t-shirts. And honestly, sublimation doesn't have the color white in the ink set, so you cannot reproduce the color white. So a white t-shirt is probably the safest thing to do. If you look at that shirt there in the middle, you see a soccer ball. Every area of the soccer ball that's white is actually no color, because there is no white ink. So when you print, those areas are left open, and the white color of the t-shirt makes up for the lack of white ink, right? But if that t-shirt was red, what color would the soccer ball be? Red and black, because that's a no color area. You're going to find that same limitation with a whole lot of your transfer papers too, because you cannot just produce the color white. There's no combination of toners or inks that blend together to make the color white. If you have a system that prints the color white, that means it has a separate ink cartridge that contains white ink that's applied separately from all the other inks. And there are, same thing with laser, there are some lasers with white toner. So blending colors together to get white is not going to happen. It takes specialized systems that have a white color ink channel to be able to get the color white. All right, so what happens is white becomes the best surface for sublimation and most of your digital transfers as well. Now, can sublimation be done on a light colored surface, for example? Yes, you see the yellow t-shirts there. Sublimation worked fine. There was no need for the color white So that worked fine. But sublimation will not work on dark colors. Okay, because really with dark colors, what you typically need is an underlay of white ink and then the colored ink on top of the white ink. Think of that as like a primer. If you had to paint a dark colored wall in a house with a lighter color, you would put down a white primer first before you put the lighter colored paint. And so that's kind of how that works too. So you do have some limitations on the colors of the products you can decorate. But luckily, we're getting more and more products too. So we're seeing products now, poly products, being produced on a wider scale and a wider range, specifically for sublimation to give you more opportunities. What do you need for sublimation? You need graphic software, an inkjet printer, and a heat press. Okay, and of course, sublimation transfer paper and sublimation ink. Of course, you need those. But you have those things. It looks like almost the same setup as using inkjet transfers. Now, a lot of times the questions come up, well, can I just, remove my inkjet inks and replace them with dye sub? No, because you're trying to clean everything out of a printer and then change the type of ink that you're putting in it is virtually impossible to get it all removed, and then you're just going to have an issue. So if you wanted to do some inkjet transfers and also sublimation, you need two separate printers. Okay, you really need two separate printers. Same heat press will work. A lot of times the same graphics will work, but two different printers because it's two different inks and two different papers. As I said, with the transfer paper here, no binders are required, though it looks a whole heck of a lot the same as some of the ones that do have the binders in there. So there is no binder. If we look at the layers, we see it's a little bit less. We have our ink management layer where we absorb our ink. We have our release layer to make sure it comes back out. And we have a paper base and a back coating, but no binder because it's not required. Now, one other area that's very interesting and worth sharing to you is what are called print cut transfers, also sometimes known as opaque transfers. And the concept here is it's a hybrid between what I call adhesive transfers, which means it's a physical material with an adhesive on the back so that material is permanently bonded to the shirt. But it's a cross between that and an inkjet transfer. So the concept is that you're going to print onto this material, and then you're going to use a cutter plotter to trim away the excess material, leaving only the printed portions behind. Okay, and that printed portion of the material, remember the backside of the material has adhesive, so that basically you made a giant decal is what you made. And then you're applying it with heat onto the surface of the t-shirt. It involves a few other things like a carrier sheet and whatnot. But it's a pretty cool process. But because it's kind of heavy-handed, people don't always like the way it looks and feels. Okay, I will say the products have gotten a lot better over the years. I've seen so much improvements. So let me show you kind of how that works real quick. You're going to need graphic software, an inkjet printer, a cutter plotter, and a heat press. Now, in this particular case, I'm talking about an inkjet printer being separate from the cutter plotter, and that's fine. But there are also cutter plotters that have inkjet printers built into them. So it's a single machine that prints and plots and cuts, okay, out the image. But you can also have two separate things. You can have a separate printer and a separate cutter plotter. So you print first, then you load that in, and you program it to cut all around the edges of the graphic, and then that's all that's left. Now this is also like it's a two-layered paper. So you're actually cutting away so that you can pull the top layer off the back, and then there's adhesive there. So it is, a specialized kind of paper product. Now, just to kind of show you how it was done, here this image was printed. Forget the plastic cover here, which is the carrier sheet. Here is the image that was actually printed onto the paper. Then the cutter plotter came back and he used a very fine, basically sharp edged knife that ran, and pretty fast, right along the edges of the graphic. You can see how my mouse is doing, and it runs faster than my mouse. And what they're doing is they're cutting away all the extra white paper, and it's also on the top layer. See, the ink does appear on the top layer, and so we're cutting away all the excess paper here and pulling it away. So it's maybe you can't tell it here, but this ink here is a top layer. The rest of the top layer has been removed. So it's really resting on this back sheet, this piece here that's been printed. All the excess around it was trimmed away. Now we take what's called the carrier sheet and we press it down on top of this item that has been cut and printed. All right, so the next page, you see we're smoothing out the wrinkles so that the carrier sheet is bonding to this. Now watch what happens. We pull it away, and you see as I'm pulling the carrier sheet up, I'm pulling away from that backing paper what was printed and cut out. Okay, so now it's on the carrier sheet, and with the carrier sheet, I can walk over to the shirt that I want to put it on. There you can see we're just kind of holding it in place. No, it's not my hands, by the way. And now we go over to the shirt, and we lay it down onto the shirt, and we actually pressed it. The carrier sheet withstands the temperature of the heat press. So we pressed it, and it activated the adhesive on the back of the printed area here. And then when we open up the heat press, we were able to pull the carrier sheet off and throw it away. And this has been bonded to the shirt. You see this is done on a black shirt because what happened is we printed onto a white material that serves as white ink, and it serves as a white base, even though there's no white ink involved. And then we trimmed away all the excess, and then we were able to apply it. So it is a methodology for doing transfers onto a dark surface, okay? But you really want to experiment with it so you feel comfortable with the process, because a lot of times people don't really like the way that, because it is heavy, you can feel it. So you would have to make sure that that is acceptable for you and your client as well. A quick summary comparison between dye sub and say cotton transfers. You can see I really don't have to walk through all of these, but there are different ways of doing things. There are different color systems, different sheets of paper. There's just some variables there, but they are different. There are some differences between them. Okay, so that brings me to the end of what I had to say today. So two things at this point. David, if you want to jump back in and kind of follow up with maybe some additional information, and then I'll take a look at any questions that we have coming in.
Yes, thank you, Jimmy. That was a great presentation as always. It explained very well the differences between all these different applications there are. Now, the very last one that Jimmy mentioned, the printing cut, that is another thing that Joto offers a very extensive range of printing cut materials. And the reason there needs to be an extensive range is because you need dedicated materials to work on different substrates when it comes to the printing cut. Now, that's generally for people with wide format eco solvent printers, but yeah, please do bear in mind that we have that. And then one other quick thing I wanted to mention before we moved on to the questions were to keep in touch for future webinars that Joto and Sawgrass are going to be giving in the future. Please sign up for our Joto e-news. It's very easy to do. You just go to Joto's homepage. I don't know if any of you are on the website right now, but if you page down towards the bottom of the home page, there's a blue banner there that just says Joto e-news. You click on that. You just let us know whether you're in Canada. There's a little drop down window. You can select Canada or the US, same thing, state or the province that you're in, and then just give us your email address, and then any future webinars that are coming up, you'll be informed of those, or any special sales or any offers that we have are generally presented that way. Now, if any of you, I don't know if Jimmy, if we've got any questions coming yet, but if there are, let's move over to the questions.
Okay, the first one's kind of long. I'm going to paraphrase it. It said that when trying to do sublimation, he ends up with a printed image, and along the edge of the printed image, he ends up with basically the blank edge of the paper. Okay, so picture this: if you took a rectangular sheet of paper, you had an image, you put it on, you sublimate it on the shirt. When you pull it off, you see this little teeny thin line where the edge of the paper was. We are well aware of that. That is called a transfer line, and that is permanent. There's no way to get rid of it except with scissors, and then we just have a big hole. That won't work. The reality is to prevent it, and to prevent it is to use a process that involves a special foam, and when I say foam, it's like a spray foam. It's a roll of foam. It's a high temperature foam, and we're basically building a soft padding under the shirt with that. And we're also going to use some different settings. So with our heat press, we're going to use lower settings on time, temperature, and pressure. And when you combine all of those together, you shouldn't get the transfer line anymore. Now, I also want to point out, while we're just talking about that type of thing, that just because a shirt is 100% polyester doesn't mean it sublimates well. And, you know, I've sublimated so many different types of shirts, or should I say brands of shirts, and I have found some that no matter what I did, I could not get a great image, or in some cases I couldn't get rid of the transfer line, so I realized that shirt was just not going to work. But majority of the shirts I have done that are polyester with sublimation, I have been able to get rid of the transfer line by using that process. Now, I don't know, David, if you have a video on your website about that. We do on the Sawgrass website about how to use the foam application.
We got so many videos up there. I'm not sure whether we actually cover that point. We certainly show somebody sublimating a shirt. But one other quick thing that I was shown recently, actually by a customer, was tearing the paper as well. Instead of cutting or trimming the sublimation paper when you're going to be putting it onto a polyester shirt, it doesn't have such a hard, straight edge to it, so it doesn't compress the fabric in the same way. If you kind of just tear around the outside of the image, it feathers it off, and then in combination with the pillow that Jimmy was talking about, that certainly lessens the effect of seeing the edge of the paper.
Yeah, and I want to give you a little caution on that one, David. I agree. I used to be a bigger believer in the tearing, and the tearing definitely softens the edge of the paper. And sometimes it works, but sometimes you end up with a transfer line that looks like the tearing of the paper. So it's one where I do caution. To me, it's sort of like something I need in an emergency, or nothing else is working. But I think that if people do learn properly the foam pillow type of method, that should take care of their problem. And as I said, there are some shirts that just don't work out because people go out and find shirts in yard sales or something, I think sometimes, because they'll throw brands at me I've never heard of, and I'm like, don't know, So the reality is, get some, shirts, learn the processes, try the tearing. I mean, I'm not against that. If that works out for you, great. But be aware that there may be some products that the tearing doesn't work as well on. So that's just my own personal experience. Just like I have burns on my hands. See, I like to tell people sometimes, David, is I'll tell them I'm a genius, and then they think I'm really conceited. And then I follow up with that because they say you learn from your mistakes. Okay,
yeah,
so
that's right.
That's why I qualify. That's why I'm the genius now. So anyway,
Right.
Okay. So here's another question. And how many times can you wash each option before they fade? That I'll say my piece. I'll let David jump in on this too. With dye sublimation, if you properly sublimated the shirt and it's 100% polyester, it should not fade ever. Okay. Now, if it's a blend, you'll see some fading that first time. All right. When it comes to other processes, a lot of it has to do with the quality of the paper, the ink, how well it bonded, and I can't really tell you a number of washings. And David, I'll let you elaborate on that as well.
Yeah, well, I think certainly with the difference between the standard ink using standard desktop inks and the laser process, it always used to be that the laser process outwashed the inkjet, but over the years the technology has improved on the inkjet paper, and now I'd say it's the equivalent to it is with a laser transfer paper. One of the things that's very important with either inkjet or laser is the amount of pressure that's applied. When you're applying the transfer to the shirt, you apply either a laser or an inkjet transfer to the garment. It's gonna, if you do it with a very low pressure, you're going to get very poor washability. And there's a great relationship between more pressure you create, the more washes you get. Now, a lot of people that are running very, very large numbers and using inkjet and laser transfer papers will actually use air-operated machines and really pound it in there like 100 psi. Now, if you do that, the washability is certainly it's going to be on there for the lifetime of the garment. But with lighter pressures, some of the very inexpensive clamshell presses, particularly with the laser paper, if they're put on with light pressure, that can cause either some peeling or some fading or cracking of the image, because although you never truly sublimate the shirt with these inkjet and laser papers, it kind of always does tend to be on the surface more than it would be with a sublimation process. If you're pounding it in there with very, very heavy pressure, it does tend to get down into the fiber of the weave of the shirt, and it tends to bond and last and feel actually too. Jimmy mentioned in his presentation that, you know, stretching a shirt after it's been imaged, that is something, if you do that while the shirt is still hot or warm when it's right off the press, that softens the area around the image, and it makes a very, very big difference.
Okay. Well, this one is certainly different. So what would be your solution for making adhesive labels that are thin and light, similar to screen printing, to be used on metal or plastic water bottles? Because I know heat cannot be used on plastic water bottles. Certainly for the metal water bottles, there are sublimation products where you can make labels. But on the plastic, I mean, you know, what comes to mind to me is something like pad printing. What do you think, David?
No, I agree. We, Joto, we certainly, if you're going to be doing metal bottles, sorry, I didn't hear whether the customer said it was white bottles or silver bottles, but certainly white metal and silver metal can be sublimated and they look absolutely fantastic. But we don't have, we don't here at Joto have a process for doing anything with plastic bottles because of all of our processes involve heat, and obviously the plastic water bottle is not going to like that very much. So I agree with you. I think pad printing is going to probably be the only option for that particular substrate.
Okay, and one more question here. How critical is the expiration date on sublimation inks? It's a use by date, not an expiration date. And it's recommended, of course, to use by that date. If you look at a carton of milk in a grocery store, they have a date, and it's actually a use by date. And they're saying, hey, the milk is freshest if you use it by this date. The next day, it doesn't automatically get sour, okay? It may be good for another week, who knows, okay? But what they're saying with the use by date is the best quality milk is, you know, that you're going to get may start going downhill after this date, okay? So the reality with inks, we do the same thing, and not just sublimation inks. You'll find this on any inks. You know, I had an HP desktop printer that has expiration dates, use by dates, is what they technically are, on every cartridge that I bought. And that stupid printer, when you reach the use by date, a lot of times it would lock up and not print anymore. But that's a different story. So the reality is, your sublimation ink, if you get to the use by date, the next day it's not going to be faulty. It's not going to break down your printer or anything else. But what we're saying is, once you reach that use by date, that is the projected lifespan of the, you know, the premium level of the ink or the premium quality of the ink. And after that, you know, it's probably going to start to deteriorate, not break down, but just start to deteriorate. I mean, everything does that. I mean, it can't be helped. So I would say be aware of that date and realize that sometime after that date, you may start having some breakdown in the ink, such that you could get some solids caught up in your ink jet heads that could interfere with the printing process. It's not going to, like I say, your printer's not going to crash the next day, but you should be aware of the date, because the longer you go past the date, the more opportunity there is for a decrease in quality and possible maintenance issues too. So I recommend everybody, when you buy ink, is write the date down, because once it's in the printer, you don't pay attention to it. But I would write it down so I'm aware of the date, and and just be aware of it from that point on. So I see a comment about printing on the ink from Mr. Dixon Sue, and he says you could try water slide for plastic. So water slide, something I'm not familiar with, but thank you, Dixon. Water slide for plastic.
Yeah, that's Dixon. He's in our technical support department here at Joto, and I think he's probably listening in, and that's a good point. Yeah, we do have an application that would allow you to do that. It's bear in mind though that it's If we were talking about particularly that plastic water bottle situation, it's not overly durable. Like, for instance, you wouldn't be able to put it in the dishwasher, or as if you were trying to purposely scratch it off,
Right.
it doesn't adhere in the same way that a sublimation process or the regular transfers would.
Yeah, but it sounds like fun with a name like Water Slide.
Yeah, it does. It is fun to use.
Does sound like fun. So, okay, so I think that wraps it up there, and we've don't have any more questions coming in. So, David, I thanks you for the invitation to join in today and enjoy, because I learned some things from you as always, and I hope that everyone else picked up some information to help them move forward and maybe make some good decisions, at least to be able to come forth to you guys and with their questions they need to ask to figure out what's the right product for them to use.
Yeah, so thanks once again, everybody, for attending. And just to reiterate, if you want to tune in for future webinars that Joto and Sawgrass are going to be, please sign up for the e-news. Again, it's just at the bottom of the homepage. Go all the way down to the bottom, click on there, sign up, and you're done. So thank you all again for attending, and have a great rest of the day, and goodbye for now.